The evening sky over the Alabama countryside hung heavy with a suffocating gloom, as if the land itself sensed the horror it was about to reveal. Shadows stretched long across the dirt roads of Selma, darkening the edges of the modest homes and plantation houses that dotted the landscape. The wind carried a faint chill, rustling the skeletal remains of the trees and whispering through the shutters of the old homesteads. It was a quiet that felt wrong, too complete, too deliberate, as though the world had paused to watch, silently complicit in the acts that had gone unnoticed for so long. In this unnatural stillness, two young women moved with a grace that belied the darkness of their intentions. They were twins, identical in appearance, their features mirror images of one another, yet the innocence of youth was tainted by a gaze that seemed to look beyond the mundane world, into a private, forbidden realm where desire and violence intertwined. Their names were whispered in hushed tones among the townsfolk, though few dared speak them aloud. Rumors traveled faster than any rider could carry them, carried on the wind like poisonous seeds, planting fear and disbelief in the minds of neighbors. "They are like shadows walking among us," one villager would mutter, his eyes darting nervously toward the horizon where the sisters were last seen. And yet, for years, no one had suspected the depth of their depravity. The murders, 17 in total, had unfolded like a dark symphony, each act carefully orchestrated and hidden beneath layers of deception and normalcy. What made the terror all the more chilling was the duality of the sisters themselves. On one hand, they were youthful, charming, and capable of the most delicate acts of care; on the other, they harbored a darkness that seemed almost unnatural, a darkness born of obsession, desire, and a twisted form of loyalty to one another. The first hints of their malevolence had been subtle, almost imperceptible to those who lived alongside them. A missing farmhand, a neighbor's child who never returned from the woods, a family's prized animals disappearing without a trace, small disturbances that, at the time, were written off as accidents, misfortunes, or the cruel whims of nature. But looking back, the patterns emerge with terrifying clarity. Each incident carried the same signature: meticulous planning, an uncanny understanding of human behavior, and a cold, calculating precision that could only come from a mind utterly detached from conventional morality. Those who later examined the scenes described them as too orderly, too intentional, a reflection of a sinister intelligence hiding behind the fragile mask of adolescence. The plantation where they lived became the epicenter of whispered dread. Its weathered walls and sprawling grounds seemed to hold secrets of their own, as if the house had absorbed the darkness of its inhabitants and now exhaled it into the surrounding fields. At dusk, the windows reflected the last light of the sun in a way that made the house appear alive, its gaze fixed on those who dared to approach. Visitors, servants, and family members all sensed it, the almost imperceptible weight of something watching, waiting, judging. The sisters moved through these halls with a confidence born not of arrogance, but of intimate knowledge. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow cast by the candlelight, every whisper of the wind against the shutters had been anticipated, used, and manipulated. On that fateful night when the events that would forever stain Selma's history began to converge, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The full moon hung low, casting a ghostly pall over the landscape, illuminating the silhouettes of the sisters as they crossed the threshold of the plantation's oldest barn. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying the faint remnants of hay and livestock, but also something else, an intangible, electric tension that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their hearts. They moved silently, deliberately, as if guided by a ritualistic understanding of what was to come. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only the unwavering certainty of a purpose that defied both logic and morality. Outside, the town slept under a blanket of ignorance, unaware of the horrors unfolding mere miles from their doors. Candles flickered in the windows of nearby homes, shadows dancing across the walls, completely oblivious to the dark twin presences that prowled the night. The silence of the town was deceptive, masking the undercurrent of fear that would soon erupt once the first bodies were discovered. When dawn finally broke, spilling pale light across the fields and roads, the first signs of what had transpired began to reveal themselves. A neighbor, drawn by an instinctive unease, stumbled upon the remnants of the night's atrocities. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life: the cold, lifeless bodies arranged with a precision that could only be described as ritualistic, the twin sisters nowhere in sight, and the eerie calm of a scene that had been deliberately crafted to shock, terrify, and confuse. The narrative of that day, that singular moment when the invisible veil of security was ripped away from Selma, begins the story that will follow. It is a story of innocence corrupted, of obsession unchecked, and of desire so twisted that it led to unspeakable acts of violence. But even in the face of such darkness, there was a strange, almost poetic symmetry in the way the sisters moved through their world. Their actions, as horrific as they were executed with a precision that suggested a ritualistic understanding of life, death, and the fragile human emotions that connect the two. It was as if they were not merely committing murder, but performing an intricate, private symphony of destruction, each note deliberate, each movement measured, and each act leaving an indelible mark upon the psyche of the town. The silent scream, as this opening chapter comes to a close, is not merely a recounting of events. It is an immersion into the psychological landscape of two individuals whose bond transcended normal comprehension, whose desires defied societal norms, and whose actions would cast a long, dark shadow over the community of Selma for generations. The stage is set for a descent into a story that is as complex as it is horrifying, a narrative that blends historical fact with the eerie cadence of a moral and psychological unraveling. By the end of this chapter, the audience is left with a profound sense of foreboding, a realization that what is to come will challenge every assumption about innocence, desire, and the hidden darkness that can dwell behind the most familiar faces. The town, the plantation, and the twins themselves now exist in a suspended state, a fragile tension between the ordinary and the grotesque. Every sound, every shadow, every whispered rumor contributes to the mounting sense of dread, pulling the viewer deeper into a story that refuses to be ignored. The silent scream is more than a moment, it is the opening breath of a tale that will explore the darkest corridors of human desire, the fragility of morality, and the unrelenting consequences of actions driven by obsession and forbidden love. It is here, amid the chill of an Alabama night and the quiet dread of an unknowing town, that the legend of the twin sisters begins, echoing across time, carrying with it a warning, a fascination, and a terror that will not easily be forgotten. Selma in 1852 was a town of contrasts, a place where the genteel appearance of Southern charm masked a web of fear, superstition, and unspoken violence. The streets, lined with modest wooden homes and grand plantations alike, seemed ordinary at first glance, yet there was an underlying tension in the way townspeople moved, spoke, and interacted. The air carried a blend of scents, freshly baked bread from the small bakeries, the acrid smoke of chimneys, the sweet perfume of magnolia trees mingled with the ever-present tang of livestock and soil. It was a town that lived in a duality of appearances, presenting civility to outsiders while concealing secrets too dark for the sunlight. Every corner, every alley, every shadowed porch seemed to hold a story waiting to unfold, and the story of the twin sisters would soon dominate all whispered conversations. The social structure of Selma was rigid yet invisible in its enforcement. Wealthy landowners presided over their plantations with an air of authority, while tenant farmers and servants carried out daily labor under strict but unspoken codes of obedience. Religion was omnipresent, its influence permeating schools, courts, and homes. The local church bells dictated the rhythm of life, signaling work, rest, and reflection, while sermons spoke of morality, sin, and divine retribution. Yet, despite this strict moral framework, the town harbored secrets, grudges buried, acts of cruelty ignored, and desires suppressed. This tension between public virtue and private vice created fertile ground for fear to grow when the unimaginable began to surface in the lives of the townspeople. The plantation that housed the twin sisters occupied a unique place in Selma's landscape. Set slightly apart from the center of town, it was both visible and isolated, a microcosm of wealth, tradition, and repression. The main house, built of weathered timber and red brick, rose above the surrounding fields like a sentinel, its porches wide and inviting by day, but foreboding in the dim light of dusk. Servants and laborers moved quietly across the grounds, their faces shadowed with worry, eyes flicking nervously toward the house as if expecting it to speak back to them. Children played near the edge of the property, yet always within earshot of a watchful adult, an instinctual caution born from unspoken knowledge of what lay within the walls. It was in this space, simultaneously familiar and alien to the townspeople, that the seeds of horror had been sown. The sisters' family, though outwardly respectable, carried its own share of secrets. The matriarch, a woman of rigid principles and sharp intellect, had instilled discipline and obedience in her daughters, emphasizing propriety and social standing above all else. The twins, identical in appearance yet distinct in temperament, were both celebrated and feared within their household. Their father, a man of considerable influence in local politics, was distant yet commanding, leaving the sisters to navigate the labyrinth of expectations and restrictions imposed upon them. Within this environment, their bond grew stronger, an interdependent connection forged from both love and isolation. While the family appeared to the town as pillars of civility and moral virtue, behind closed doors, the twins cultivated a world of private rituals, secret exchanges, and obsessions that would ultimately escalate into murder. Selma itself seemed to react to the presence of the sisters as though it sensed the disturbance in its moral equilibrium. Townspeople spoke in hushed tones about oddities, a lingering glance exchanged between the twins, unexplained absences, and moments when their laughter carried an edge that suggested something more sinister than childlike mischief. Gossip traveled quickly, yet no one could quite pin down the nature of the fear. Each account was fragmented, partial, often contradictory, but collectively they formed an undercurrent of unease that pulsed through the town. The fear was not yet overt, but it existed, tangible in the way doors were locked a moment longer, windows were drawn shut more tightly, and conversations faltered when the twins were mentioned. The local economy, modest yet interconnected, also played a role in shaping the backdrop of this story. Markets bustled during the day, merchants calling out wares, horses clopping over cobblestone paths, and children running errands with baskets of produce. Yet behind this vibrancy lay subtle reminders of mortality and violence, the persistent labor of enslaved workers, the precarious health of livestock, and the omnipresent threat of disease. Life in Selma was never without its shadows, its undercurrents of death and suffering, and the sisters' crimes would find fertile ground in this environment of tension and quiet dread. Religion, superstition, and folklore were inseparable from the town's identity. Stories of spirits, curses, and divine punishment were common, often used to explain misfortune or to enforce social obedience. Elders would recount tales of spectral figures wandering the fields at night or of sins punished by mysterious illnesses. These stories, passed from one generation to the next, created a framework through which the townspeople interpreted unexplained events. When the sisters' first violent acts began to surface, the lines between reality and superstition blurred, feeding a collective anxiety that made the unimaginable seem plausible, and the rational appear insufficient. Despite its outward calm, Selma was a town on the edge of tension, teetering between normalcy and the abyss. Each family, each household, each person carried within them the potential for both kindness and cruelty, a duality mirrored in the twins themselves. The arrival of the story that would consume Selma, the revelation of 17 murders committed by 2 young women in the name of desire, was not merely an event, it was an awakening. The town, with its blend of order and secrecy, morality and vice, faith and fear, became both a witness and a participant in the unraveling of innocence. By situating the audience in Selma with all its sensory richness, social intricacy, and latent dread, the narrative prepares the viewer for the full scope of the horror to come. The town is not a passive backdrop, but a living, breathing entity whose values, fears, and weaknesses amplify the actions of the twin sisters. Every street, every home, every shadowed corner is imbued with tension, setting the stage for a story that will unfold not only through acts of violence, but through the psychological and moral decay of a community confronted with its own vulnerabilities. Selma's darkness is not just historical, it is emotional, atmospheric, and enduring, a reflection of both the era and the unimaginable acts of those who would shatter its fragile equilibrium. From the earliest days of their childhood, the sisters were inseparable, moving through the world as though they shared a single mind. They were identical not only in appearance, dark, reflective eyes, delicate features, and hair that fell in perfect symmetry, but also in thought and gesture, each anticipating the other's movements with uncanny precision. To the casual observer, their bond might have seemed a testament to familial devotion, the innocent closeness of twins. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent normalcy lay an intensity that defied explanation, a private world of emotion and thought that excluded all others. Their attachment, though born of love, gradually took on a more obsessive character, a merging of identities that blurred the line between self and other, and planted the seeds for the darkness that would come. Neighbors often remarked on their strange synchronization, the way one sister would smile just as the other's lips parted, or how they would finish each other's sentences with eerie accuracy. There were afternoons spent in the woods behind their family home where they would walk for hours without speaking, communicating instead through subtle gestures, a tilt of the head or a glance that carried meaning only they understood. To outsiders, these were innocent signs of closeness, but to those who observed carefully, there was an undercurrent of something more, a possessiveness that could turn cruel if challenged, a gaze that measured loyalty and punished deviation. Friends who tried to intervene or redirect their focus found themselves gently but persistently ignored, replaced in their world by the other twin. Within the walls of the family home, this intensity grew unchecked. The sisters created their own rituals, small ceremonies of secrecy that bound them ever tighter together. They would whisper in corners, sharing thoughts and plans without ever being overheard. Diaries, often hidden beneath loose floorboards, contained intricate sketches, coded language, and fragments of thought that hinted at the dark explorations of desire, control, and power. What began as games of imagination gradually evolved into experiments with fear and manipulation, first targeting animals, then servants, then strangers who strayed too close to their hidden sphere. Each act was carefully recorded and reflected upon, a catalogue of small triumphs and tests of control that gradually escalated in severity and audacity. The family, though attentive to appearances, failed to recognize the depth of their daughter's obsession. The matriarch, confident in her ability to instill morality and social conformity, regarded their closeness as harmless and even admirable. Their father, preoccupied with estate matters and political influence, noticed the twins' affinity but did not delve into its darker implications. Within this environment of superficial vigilance and emotional distance, the twins' bond strengthened unchecked, becoming a closed system in which only their mutual desire and shared understanding mattered. The isolation that the family inadvertently fostered allowed their private world to flourish, a laboratory of psychological intensity where boundaries, morality, and empathy were tested and ultimately discarded. Observers occasionally noted small, disturbing behaviors. Servants would report that animals disappeared under inexplicable circumstances, or that the twins had stared too long at certain neighbors, their expressions unreadable, almost predatory. Children who attempted to join in play were gently rebuffed, then excluded entirely, as if the twins' world could not accommodate anyone else. On rare occasions, one sister would lash out when the other's attention wandered, a flicker of jealousy that revealed the depth of their interdependence. These incidents, while minor individually, hinted at an underlying pathology, a psychological intensity that would later manifest in a manner too terrifying to be ignored. By adolescence, the bond had transformed into something far more complex. The sisters began to articulate their desire for exclusivity in subtle, coded ways, their conversations revealing an almost ritualistic devotion to each other. They referred to themselves collectively in diaries and private letters, erasing individuality in favor of a singular identity. Their fascination with control, secrecy, and transgression intensified, and the seeds of violence that had lain dormant began to sprout. Small acts of cruelty were experimented with deliberately, animals were trapped and observed for reactions, servants were subtly manipulated into fear or compliance, and the emotional responses of family members were catalogued and studied. Each success in this psychological game emboldened them, confirming their belief that their shared bond justified the manipulation of those around them. Friends and peers found themselves drawn in and repelled simultaneously. The sisters were captivating, their beauty and intelligence alluring, yet there was an undeniable tension in their presence, a hint of danger that kept people at a careful distance. They could charm, persuade, and intimidate without effort, using their twin connection as a silent, unspoken advantage. In groups, they often acted as one, anticipating each other's thoughts, reinforcing arguments, and creating an almost hypnotic effect that left others questioning their own perceptions. This dynamic only served to reinforce their belief in their uniqueness, further isolating them from societal norms and moral accountability. The psychological implications of their bond were profound. Each sister's sense of self was intertwined with the others, creating a dependency that could not tolerate interference. This symbiosis fueled both creativity and cruelty, producing a mindset in which normal social boundaries were irrelevant, empathy was negotiable, and desire justified acts that would otherwise be unthinkable. The twins became not only partners but mirrors of one another, reflecting and amplifying impulses, fears, and obsessions in a continuous feedback loop. Within this loop, the notion of morality or consequence was abstract, distant, and ultimately irrelevant. It was in this state of obsessive interdependence that the first acts of violence, experimentation, and control began to crystallize. The twins' private world, once a sanctuary of imagination and closeness, had become a crucible of moral inversion, in which innocence and corruption were indistinguishable. Each minor transgression, each calculated act of manipulation, served to reinforce their sense of omnipotence, and each success emboldened them further. They were no longer merely sisters, they were a singular force of desire and determination, a duality that the world could neither penetrate nor understand. The foundation laid by these early years of intense connection and secretive ritual would set the stage for the horrors to come. The town of Selma, the family home, and the unsuspecting neighbors were soon to become actors in a drama of obsession, control, and murder. The twins' bond, once a private fascination, had become a weapon, one that would devastate lives and redefine the limits of human attachment. By the end of this section, the audience comes to understand that the true terror of the sisters lies not merely in their acts, but in the psychological architecture of their bond, a secret that binds them in a way no outsider could ever hope to dismantle. The intimacy of their connection, both beautiful and grotesque, is the axis upon which all ensuing horror will turn. As night fell over Selma, the town streets took on an eerie stillness, a silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The lanterns flickered along the cobblestone roads, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the walls of the modest homes. Within these shadows, stories began to stir, whispered first in hushed tones behind closed doors, then carried through the night like a slow-moving fog. People spoke of strange occurrences, small disappearances, and odd patterns of behavior that seemed to defy explanation. At first, no one connected these seemingly unrelated events, dismissing them as misfortune, coincidence, or the natural hazards of rural life. Yet as the nights wore on, an unsettling pattern began to emerge, one that would eventually reveal the true nature of the twin sisters' dark influence. The first whispers were subtle. A neighbor's child would vanish from the garden for a few hours, only to reappear pale and silent, eyes wide with fear that could not be explained. A farmhand might fail to return from the fields at dusk, leaving behind a worried family and unanswered questions. Animals disappeared in ways that seemed impossible, leaving no sign of struggle or predator. The townspeople, steeped in superstition and wary of misfortune, began to murmur about curses and bad luck. Yet even as these whispers spread, no one could articulate the full scope of what was happening. Fear lingered like a thick fog, creeping into homes, gathering momentum in conversations, and shaping the perception of an ordinary town descending into dread. The twins, meanwhile, moved with deliberate subtlety, their acts of cruelty and manipulation executed under the cloak of darkness. They seemed to understand the rhythms of human observation, the way townsfolk noticed patterns yet often dismissed them as trivial or unrelated. When a child went missing, it was never long enough to cause full panic. When livestock vanished, it was explained away as predation or disease. In these small manipulations, the sisters refined their methods, learning how far they could push the boundaries before suspicion arose. Each successful act emboldened them, allowing them to operate with increasing confidence, leaving the town teetering on the edge of unease without ever fully understanding why. The whispers of the night began to take on a rhythm of their own. Servants in the plantations would exchange furtive glances and quiet comments about the twins' behavior, while children recounted brief, fragmentary encounters with strange, inexplicable events. There were stories of lights flickering in empty rooms, doors left ajar without explanation, and the distant sound of laughter that carried a hollow, almost predatory edge. Elders would shake their heads, muttering about the foolishness of imagination, yet their expressions betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, a recognition that the ordinary rules of life were being subtly, insidiously rewritten. With each whisper, the town's collective anxiety grew, a swelling undercurrent that would soon break through into open terror. The first serious reports emerged when a servant claimed to have seen the twins near the edge of the woods late at night, carrying what appeared to be bundles swaddled in cloth. The description was vague, the details uncertain, but the implication was horrifying. Families began to lock doors more securely, neighbors spoke in quieter tones, and small groups formed to watch for any unusual activity. Even as fear grew, there remained a reluctance to act decisively. The twins' outward appearance of innocence, their carefully maintained charm, and the social position of their family all contributed to a collective hesitancy. People wanted to believe that the horrors suggested by rumor could not possibly be real. Denial became a fragile shield against a creeping dread that none were prepared to confront. Despite this, the tension in Selma became palpable. Public spaces that had once been lively, the market square, the tavern, the churchyard, now felt charged with unease. Conversations faltered when the twins' name was mentioned. Parents clutched their children closer as they walked home at dusk. Servants hesitated to complete chores after dark, moving with an almost imperceptible wariness. The town had not yet grasped the full scope of the sisters' actions, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Fear had become tangible, a living presence threading through every street, every home, every shadowed corner. The pattern of disappearances, though sporadic, created a slow-burning panic. It was impossible to predict the next incident, yet impossible to ignore the ones that had already occurred. The townspeople began to notice subtle consistencies. Each event happened at night, always near the twins' known haunts, and often involved those who had come into direct contact with them. These connections were never fully articulated in public, whispered instead in the back rooms of taverns and in hushed prayers within the church. Rumor and fact became intertwined, creating a mythic quality around the twins' presence that both amplified fear and obscured the truth. The sisters themselves were acutely aware of the town's growing unease. Their actions were no longer simply experiments in cruelty but strategic exercises in psychological dominance. They reveled in the tension, understanding that fear could be as powerful a weapon as any physical act of violence. They learned to time their movements, to manipulate visibility and rumor, and to maintain the delicate balance between being observed and remaining undetected. This mastery over perception allowed them to continue their secret activities without immediate consequence, feeding a cycle of escalation that would soon make the full scale of their crimes impossible to ignore. At the heart of these whispers was the duality of the twins' existence, outwardly beautiful, charming, and seemingly innocent, yet beneath that exterior, calculating, remorseless, and driven by an obsession that defied comprehension. Every shadow seemed to bend toward them, every unexplained noise was attributed to their unseen presence. The town, still clinging to rational explanations, found itself in a liminal space where imagination and reality merged. In this suspended state of fear, the groundwork was laid for the eventual revelation of their crimes. As the nights passed and the whispers multiplied, a creeping sense of inevitability began to take hold. The townspeople could feel that something terrible was looming, a darkness coiled just beyond the edges of perception. Yet despite this instinctive awareness, no one could predict the magnitude of the horror that the twins were capable of. The suspense built incrementally, threaded through conversations, observed behaviors, and unexplained events, creating a tapestry of fear that enveloped Selma in a quiet, pervasive dread. By the end of this period, the town had been transformed. No longer merely a backdrop, Selma itself became a character in the story, a place alive with suspicion, anxiety, and foreboding. The whispers in the night were not simply rumor, they were the first warning of a larger, darker truth, signaling that the ordinary rhythms of life had been disrupted by forces unseen, yet intimately close. The stage was set for the coming revelations, the unmasking of the sisters' true nature, and the inevitable descent of the town into a confrontation with evil that would leave scars far deeper than any physical wound. The town of Selma, steeped in tradition and religious devotion, struggled to reconcile the whispers of horror with the orderly world it had long known. Church steeples rose above the streets like watchful sentinels, their bells tolling the rhythm of daily life, yet the very faith that guided the townspeople now seemed insufficient to explain the growing unease. Rumors of disappearances, strange nocturnal sightings, and subtle acts of cruelty spread, but the human mind resisted fully accepting such darkness. To admit that evil had taken root so close to home was almost impossible, and so the town clung to denial, rationalizing each event as coincidence, misfortune, or divine testing of their patience. The psychological tension between instinctive fear and the comfort of faith became palpable. Clergy members attempted to frame these anomalies within the familiar boundaries of sin and moral failing. Sermons at the local church emphasized vigilance against temptation, the omnipresence of evil in the world, and the necessity of prayer to shield oneself from darkness. Parishioners were reminded that God's justice would eventually reveal wrongdoing, yet the message did little to alleviate their immediate dread. Some church leaders even suggested that the strange events were the result of the devil working through human weakness, insinuating that the disappearances and oddities might be moral tests rather than crimes. This interpretation offered the townspeople a framework in which their fear could exist safely, contained within the structure of divine order rather than as a reflection of human malevolence. Family members of the missing began to grow desperate, yet even they struggled to confront the possibility that two young women, innocent in appearance, cherished in social circles, could be the source of such horror. Letters were written to friends and relatives, pleading for understanding, but the language often betrayed a hesitancy to name the twins explicitly. The idea seemed unthinkable, even heretical, that individuals so young, so familiar, and so outwardly virtuous could be capable of orchestrating deliberate acts of violence. This tension between visible innocence and suspected guilt heightened the sense of unreality, creating an almost surreal atmosphere where everyone suspected something terrible, yet no one wanted to confront it openly. Denial manifested in other ways as well. Town councils and committees convened to discuss the disappearances and strange events, yet resolutions remained tentative, vague, and uncommitted. Neighbors attempted to cover for one another, to downplay incidents, and to offer rational explanations that would preserve the town's sense of safety. Each act of denial, though well-intentioned, only provided the twins with a greater margin of freedom. Their crimes, subtle and calculated, continued to unfold while the community argued over whether to act, whom to believe, and how to reconcile the growing body of evidence with the comforting illusions of normalcy. The tension between faith and denial created an environment of dual perception. Some townspeople began to see the world in contradictory ways. Daylight brought a sense of safety and order, while nightfall revealed the undercurrent of fear, suspicion, and unseen malice. Mothers would hesitate at windows, scanning the shadows for anything that seemed out of place. Fathers walked streets with unspoken worry, eyes flicking to the edges of trees and alleys. Each person felt the weight of their own helplessness and moral uncertainty, yet the outward appearance of faith demanded composure, ritual, and adherence to societal expectation. The community became a living paradox, alive with apprehension, yet striving to appear serene, moral, and rational. Stories began to coalesce into semi-mythical narratives. The twins, whose actions were so secretive and precise, were rumored to possess uncanny abilities, an almost supernatural insight into human behavior, an unerring capacity to avoid detection, a connection to forces beyond comprehension. Servants spoke of feeling watched, of seeing fleeting shadows in candlelight, and of hearing whispers with no source. Neighbors interpreted these sensations through the lens of religion, attributing them to divine warning or the presence of malevolent spirits. Faith became both a shield and a prison. It allowed the townspeople to categorize what they did not understand, but it also prevented them from confronting the reality of human evil in its most intimate form. The psychological strain on the town was compounded by the contrast between the sisters' outward appearance and the horror of their acts. In daylight, they moved through the streets with charm and poise, participating in social gatherings, attending church, and appearing entirely ordinary. Yet the inexplicable disappearances and the growing body of whispered evidence suggested something deeply unnatural. The dissonance between visible innocence and suspected malevolence intensified communal anxiety. People began to question not only the twins but their own judgment, their faith, and the moral structures that had guided them for generations. Attempts to rationalize the event sometimes bordered on fanaticism. Individuals would perform prayers and rituals in private, seeking protection and absolution. Amulets and charms were secretly placed in doorways, symbolic gestures meant to ward off the invisible threat. Some citizens even began avoiding certain roads or homes at night, convinced that spiritual forces were as dangerous as human ones. Yet these rituals, while comforting, also reinforced the pervasive sense that reality had become unreliable, that faith alone could not fully explain or contain the darkness spreading through Selma. Within this atmosphere of denial and spiritual struggle, the sisters continued to operate unimpeded. Their awareness of the town's hesitancy, the reliance on faith over direct investigation, and the psychological paralysis that fear created allowed them to escalate their plans. Each act of violence became a test of the town's ability to perceive, act, and enforce moral law, and each success emboldened them further. The interplay between their outward innocence, the townspeople's faith, and the collective denial created a tension that would drive the narrative forward, ensuring that when the truth was finally confronted, the impact would be all the more shocking. By the end of this period, the town of Selma existed in a fragile equilibrium between awareness and disbelief. Faith offered a semblance of order, yet denial allowed the horror to grow unchecked. The stage was set for the coming escalation, as subtle fear transformed into active suspicion, and the town's attempts to interpret reality collided with the stark, brutal truth of the twins' actions. The tension between divine understanding and human horror, between the comforting illusions of morality and the stark evidence of evil, would define the next stage of the story, a stage in which the first confessions, the unraveling of secrecy, and the undeniable revelation of murder would begin to shatter the fragile veneer of civility. The day of revelation began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the shadowed corners of the plantation house. The sisters, who had until then concealed their intentions with remarkable cunning, were confronted in a moment of rare vulnerability by a trusted figure, a relative known for patience, discretion, and an unwavering concern for the household. It began as a conversation about minor indiscretions, small acts of mischief that could be easily dismissed, yet the tension in the room was palpable. The twins, always attuned to one another, moved in perfect unison, their eyes locking briefly with a shared understanding, a silent communication that had long replaced ordinary speech. What followed was neither a complete confession nor a dramatic outburst, but a series of carefully measured revelations, fragments of truth that hinted at the full scope of their depravity. The first words, whispered with a chilling calm, described acts that were previously only suspected in rumor. The relative listened, torn between disbelief and mounting horror, as the sisters recounted their manipulations, their experiments with fear, and the careful orchestration of disappearances. Each detail was presented with meticulous precision, as though the twins were recounting an elaborate performance rather than crimes of unthinkable severity. They spoke of timing, method, and observation, describing how they had studied their victims' behaviors, gauged reactions, and executed each act with calculated intent. The relative, unable to fully process the depth of their admissions, felt a cold weight settle in the chest, an instinctive understanding that the horror extended far beyond anything imagined. As the confessions unfolded, the psychological dynamics of the sisters became clear. They did not merely act in tandem, they reinforced, encouraged, and rationalized each other's impulses. Each admission was punctuated by shared glances, subtle nods, and small, almost imperceptible smiles, revealing a bond that was as dangerous as it was intimate. Their obsession with one another provided a framework through which acts of violence were not only justified but celebrated. In their private world, morality was mutable, empathy negotiable, and consequences distant abstractions. The relative, recognizing the magnitude of what was being revealed, struggled to respond, oscillating between disbelief, attempts at reasoning, and the instinctive urge to remove the sisters from the space altogether. The emotional impact of the confessions extended beyond the immediate listener. Even at this early stage, the narrative of their crimes began to take on a haunting clarity. The sisters described the meticulous steps they had taken to conceal evidence, the ways in which they exploited the town's denial and reliance on faith, and the careful selection of victims, all in service of sustaining their private bond and executing their desires. Each revelation was a layer added to the chilling portrait of two young women whose intelligence, charm, and outward innocence masked a relentless, calculating darkness. The contrast between the simplicity of their appearance and the complexity of their acts intensified the horror, leaving the listener, and eventually, the audience, with an uneasy realization: the twins were not impulsive, they were deliberate, methodical, and entirely conscious of the terror they inspired. The confessions also illuminated the psychological strategies that had allowed the sisters to evade suspicion for so long. They described how small acts of kindness, playful charm, and apparent vulnerability had disarmed those around them, creating a social armor that shielded them from scrutiny. Friends, family members, and neighbors had been unwitting participants in a carefully constructed illusion, each drawn into the twins' web by subtle manipulation and the power of perception. In revealing these strategies, the sisters exposed the fragility of social trust and the ease with which appearances can be weaponized, a lesson that would reverberate throughout Selma as the full truth gradually came to light. The relative, grappling with the weight of these revelations, attempted to anchor the sisters to reality. Questions were asked, boundaries tested, and moral frameworks invoked, yet each challenge was met with calm, persuasive responses that demonstrated the sisters' psychological acuity. They rationalized each act, offering explanations that were disturbing in their logic and clarity. Their language was precise, their attention to detail meticulous, and their tone deceptively calm, creating a tension between the horror of the content and the composure of its delivery. It was this combination, cold calculation and intimate devotion, that made the confessions so profoundly unsettling. These initial admissions marked a turning point. Although not publicly known, the family now possessed a glimpse into the full scope of the terror that had unfolded around them. The relative, burdened with this knowledge, faced an agonizing moral dilemma: how to act without provoking further harm, how to protect the community while navigating the dangerous dynamics of the household, and how to reconcile the image of the twins they had always known with the darkness they had now revealed. The psychological stakes were immense, every decision carried the potential to either contain or escalate the horror. This tension set the stage for the eventual public revelation and underscored the delicate, precarious balance between secrecy, fear, and moral responsibility. As the confessions continued, the sisters recounted specific incidents that revealed both cruelty and cunning. They spoke of victims chosen for proximity, predictability, and perceived vulnerability. They described methods that were chillingly efficient, often involving deception, calculated isolation, and an awareness of human psychology that bordered on preternatural. Each story was delivered with calm detachment, as though the act of confession itself was a controlled ritual, a performance designed to impress, intimidate, and establish authority over the listener. In their eyes, the world existed as a series of objects, each to be studied, manipulated, and, if necessary, removed. The relative observed the emotional and psychological interplay between the sisters, noting how each confession strengthened their connection, reinforcing their shared identity and mutual justification. The bond that had begun as childhood intimacy now manifested as a shared philosophy of control and desire, a worldview in which moral and social constraints were irrelevant. In this moment, the relative realized the enormity of what had been hidden. The sisters were not merely accomplices, they were extensions of each other, two halves of a single, unyielding force. Their confessions revealed a terrifying symmetry, an almost ritualistic coordination that elevated their crimes from mere acts of violence to deliberate, obsessive manifestations of their intertwined psyche. By the conclusion of this period of disclosure, the groundwork was laid for the larger unfolding of events. The first confessions, though partial, confirmed suspicions, validated rumors, and shattered the fragile illusions of innocence that had surrounded the twins. The relative, carrying the burden of this knowledge, became a silent witness to the depth of depravity, the intensity of obsession, and the calculated intelligence of the sisters. The psychological complexity revealed in these admissions would inform every subsequent investigation, social interaction, and community response. The stage was set for escalation, as secrecy would give way to exposure, denial to confrontation, and whispered fear to open horror. In the aftermath of these confessions, a chilling clarity emerged. The sisters' crimes were not the result of fleeting impulse or irrational madness, they were deliberate, methodical, and inseparably linked to their obsessive bond. The first confessions revealed the architecture of their cruelty, the precision of their planning, and the inexorable logic of their actions. For the town of Selma, these revelations were the first true glimpses into the abyss, a prelude to the inevitable confrontation with a darkness that had, until now, existed only in shadow, rumor, and whispered fear. This section delves deeply into the town's desperate attempts to understand the inexplicable behavior of the Winters twins through the lens of early science, superstition, and evolving medical thought of the mid-19th century. Following the increasing number of mysterious deaths and the eerie reports surrounding the sisters, a traveling physician arrives in Cold Hollow, determined to apply rational explanation to what many considered beyond comprehension. The narrative opens with his arrival, describing the townspeople's mix of hope, fear, and skepticism. The doctor is depicted as meticulous yet visibly uneasy, noting the twins' synchronized movements, their mirrored gestures, and their uncanny ability to anticipate each other's thoughts before they are spoken. Observers describe the girls' expressions as eerily blank, yet occasionally flickering with a strange intensity that seems to pierce directly into anyone who approaches. The summary details how the doctor begins with rudimentary tests, relying on contemporary theories of hysteria, nervous disorders, and twin psychology. He measures pulse rates, notes responses to stimuli, and attempts rudimentary questioning, but each session ends in frustration. The girls' bond appears so absolute that separating them, even temporarily, results in episodes of fainting, self-harm, and profound psychological distress. The narrative explores how this challenges the medical understanding of the period, highlighting the tension between rational observation and phenomena that elude standard categorization. Simultaneously, local scholars and curious townspeople weigh in with their own theories. Some suggest inherited madness, citing the Winters family's history of mental illness and tragedy. Others invoke religious explanations, claiming divine punishment or possession. A small group even speculates about witchcraft or supernatural influence, though such ideas are carefully suppressed by clergy insisting the events are tests of faith, not portents of darkness. The summary portrays the town caught in a web of competing explanations, none fully satisfying, as the victims continue to mount and anxiety spreads. The section intensifies by describing increasingly desperate attempts at control and experimentation. The doctor recommends limited separation, believing the twins' shared consciousness might be overstated, but every attempt ends catastrophically. Minor seizures escalate to unconsciousness, behavioral disturbances intensify, and the townspeople, initially reassured by the promise of science, begin to whisper that reason has no dominion here. Even instruments designed to measure physical response, pulse, respiration, reflexes, fail to reveal anomalies that align with observable phenomena. Each failure reinforces the growing sense of dread and incomprehension. The narrative then explores the psychological toll on the medical professional himself. He becomes obsessed with recording minute details of the twins' behavior, documenting every subtle twitch, glance, and pause. Sleep-deprived and increasingly isolated, he questions whether he is observing illness, genius, or something entirely otherworldly. The section contrasts his rational scientific approach with the visceral fear of the townspeople, painting a portrait of reason struggling against a reality that refuses to yield its secrets. This section also examines the reactions of the surrounding community as they attempt to reconcile reason with fear. Families debate whether to flee, lock their doors at night, or continue daily routines under a cloud of anxiety. Church leaders attempt to maintain moral order, yet even their sermons begin to reveal subtle cracks, acknowledging the incomprehensible nature of the events while insisting that faith and divine vigilance must guide the people. The summary emphasizes the interplay between science, superstition, and fear, portraying Cold Hollow as a society teetering on the brink of psychological collapse. Finally, the section foreshadows the ultimate inability of rational inquiry to contain the unfolding horror. Despite meticulous records, careful observation, and repeated testing, the twins' behavior continues to escalate beyond prediction. The narrative closes with a chilling reflection: the line between reason and darkness has blurred, leaving both the doctor and the townspeople to confront the terrifying possibility that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only endured. The lingering tension sets the stage for the next narrative section, where the twins' actions culminate in a violent and inescapable climax. This section chronicles the pivotal night when Cold Hollow's fragile veneer of order and denial utterly collapsed, marked by a rare celestial event, a meteor shower that streaked across the Alabama sky, casting a surreal, silver light over the town and surrounding woods. The narrative opens with vivid description of the town's evening. Families gathered in windows and on porches to witness the spectacle, unaware that this night would become infamous in local memory. The falling stars are portrayed not just as a natural phenomenon, but as a symbolic harbinger, casting the ordinary world in an otherworldly glow that mirrors the strange and escalating behavior of the Winters twins. The section immediately establishes tension, contrasting the town's momentary awe and delight with the undercurrent of dread growing in the shadows. The summary details how, as the townspeople watched the heavens, the twins moved through the pine forests in a pattern that witnesses later described as calculated, ritualistic, and untraceable. Their presence in multiple locations within a short period defied both explanation and understanding, lending an almost supernatural quality to their actions. Locals report that their voices carried faintly across the clearing, yet when approached, no words could be discerned, only whispers and half-uttered phrases that left those nearby unsettled and uncertain. The narrative emphasizes the increasing tension between perception and reality. What townspeople saw with their eyes and heard with their ears refused to conform to logic or expectation, heightening the sense of unease. As the night progressed, 5 bodies were discovered in rapid succession, each located in areas connected to the twins' movements earlier that evening. The summary reconstructs these tragic events with careful attention to timing and atmosphere. A farmer returning from the fields finds a child in the creek, a livestock caretaker discovers a lifeless figure near the barn, others are found near paths leading into dense woods, their deaths seemingly random but hauntingly precise in relation to the twins' actions. Panic spreads through Cold Hollow as word of the deaths reaches the town center, shattering any remnants of disbelief. The narrative captures the growing chaos. Neighbors rush from home to home, searching for missing children, livestock, and anyone who may have witnessed the twins' nocturnal journey. The section also explores the twins' enigmatic behavior during this collapse. When confronted by search parties, they appear outwardly calm, their expressions unreadable, almost detached from the world around them. Attempts at communication yield only cryptic glances, synchronized gestures, and occasionally a chilling silence that seems to mock the frantic energy of the townspeople. Witness testimonies describe a strange, almost magnetic pull, the sense that the twins' presence dominated the environment, bending perception and filling observers with a disorienting mix of fear and fascination. This portrayal heightens the psychological horror, emphasizing the contrast between outward innocence and the magnitude of the events unfolding. The narrative details the desperate measures taken by authorities and townsfolk alike. Search parties form, armed with lanterns and farm tools, moving cautiously through the moonlit fields and forests. Local clergy attempt to invoke prayer and ritual, insisting that divine intervention will restore order. However, the summary conveys the futility of these efforts. Each attempted intervention is met with inexplicable outcomes, reinforcing the perception that the twins operate under forces beyond comprehension or control. The tension between human action and inexplicable events underscores the collapse of societal constraint, as logic, morality, and faith are all tested and found wanting. The summary also examines the emotional impact on the community. Families retreat indoors, some locking doors and windows for the first time in memory, while others flee into the surrounding countryside, unwilling to risk continued exposure to the twins' movements. The town's sense of safety erodes completely, replaced by fear, paranoia, and suspicion. Children are forbidden from wandering outside, and even routine activities are approached with caution, the normal rhythms of life disrupted irreparably. The narrative emphasizes how a single night transformed Cold Hollow from a seemingly orderly settlement into a town gripped by chaos, uncertainty, and terror. Finally, this section reflects on the broader symbolic weight of the meteor shower and the night's events. The falling stars, bright and ephemeral, serve as a stark metaphor for the sudden, uncontrollable descent into darkness that the town experiences. The narrative closes with the town at dawn, exhausted and fractured, grappling with the incomprehensible scope of the tragedy, and realizing that the constraints that once governed behavior, belief, and social order have vanished. The stage is set for the aftermath, with Cold Hollow poised on the brink of permanent disintegration, haunted by both the tangible losses of the night and the lingering, unanswerable questions about the twins' motives and powers. This section examines the immediate aftermath of the catastrophic events that unfolded on the night of the falling stars, when Cold Hollow was left in a state of collective shock, grief, and fear. The narrative begins at dawn, with the town emerging from a night of horror to find the extent of the tragedy, bodies discovered across fields, forest clearings, and along the riverbanks, while the Winters twins themselves are nowhere to be found, leaving only fragments of evidence and a trail of unnerving clues behind them. The atmosphere is heavy with disbelief, the familiar rhythms of daily life, chickens clucking, blacksmiths hammering, children playing, feel muted and fragile against the overwhelming sense of loss. Families are depicted wandering the town, searching for missing members, consoling one another, or silently absorbing the enormity of what has occurred. The summary explores how Cold Hollow, previously a tight-knit, faith-bound community, begins to unravel psychologically. Households shutter their doors, and neighbors avoid contact with one another out of fear, suspicion, or a mixture of both. Ordinary conversations now carry an undercurrent of dread, with townspeople whispering about the girls and the terrible acts attributed to them, unsure whether to speak openly or remain silent in the hope that acknowledging the events might summon further misfortune. The narrative details the emotional fragmentation of the community. Some families flee entirely, abandoning farms and homes, while others cling to routine in a desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of normalcy that has been irrevocably shattered. Attention is given to the authorities and clergy who attempt to restore order and meaning. Town leaders hold emergency meetings in the church hall, deliberating over legal and moral obligations while grappling with their own fears. Religious figures offer sermons that oscillate between reassurance and admonition, warning the populace of divine judgment while urging patience and faith. Despite their efforts, the summary emphasizes the futility of these interventions. The townspeople are too traumatized, and the events too extraordinary, for traditional authority to provide solace. The clash between institutional guidance and lived terror creates a palpable tension that underscores the section's focus on societal collapse. The narrative then shifts to individual experiences of grief, confusion, and lingering fear. Survivors recount encounters with the twins, brief glimpses in shadowed doorways, whispered voices carried on the wind, and inexplicable coincidences that suggest the girl's presence is still inescapable. The section details the psychological toll, sleeplessness, nightmares, paranoia, and an emerging culture of suspicion within families and neighborhoods. Even mundane activities, drawing water from the river, tending livestock, walking to the market, become acts fraught with anxiety. The summary highlights the insidious way trauma spreads, infecting the collective consciousness of the town long after the immediate danger seems to have passed. Additionally, this section examines the fading and fragmented traces of the Winters twins themselves. Rumors circulate regarding their fate. Some insist they were apprehended by distant authorities, others believe they perished in the woods, while a few whisper of darker, more inexplicable possibilities. The narrative emphasizes the uncertainty surrounding their ultimate destiny, creating an emotional void in the town's story that intensifies the sense of unresolved tension. This absence becomes a central point of collective obsession, a haunting reminder of events that cannot be fully explained or contained. The summary also contextualizes the social and economic consequences of the events. Farms lie untended, crops begin to fail, and trade slows as fear governs the movement of people and goods. Families who remain struggle to maintain basic survival while navigating the psychological remnants of terror. The narrative conveys a profound sense of societal stagnation, portraying Cold Hollow as a town suspended between memory and catastrophe, unable to return fully to its prior state. Finally, the section closes with a reflective, almost literary tone, considering the emotional and moral weight of what occurred. The town, now fractured and weary, carries the memory of that night as both a personal and communal scar. The summary emphasizes the interplay of silence and speculation, grief and suspicion, and the enduring mystery of the Winters twins' motives and actions. The lingering dread sets the stage for subsequent analysis and interpretation, highlighting the unresolved questions and psychological resonance that continue to haunt Cold Hollow long after the physical chaos has ended. This section explores the enduring legacy of the Winters twins and the countless unanswered questions that have haunted Cold Hollow and historians for decades. The narrative opens decades after the events of 1852, with the town slowly recovering its physical structure but never fully restoring its psychological or cultural equilibrium. Buildings have been repaired, crops replanted, and families returned, but the collective memory of that horrific winter lingers, passed down through generations in hushed conversations, coded warnings, and folklore that blends history with myth. The section emphasizes how memory itself becomes a vessel for both fear and fascination, shaping the identity of the town and coloring the perception of subsequent events. The summary details the various theories that emerged over time. Psychologists and medical historians have proposed that the twins suffered from a rare form of shared psychosis, sometimes referred to as folie à deux, where their symbiotic bond amplified delusional thinking and compulsive behavior. Others suggest the influence of trauma, early family losses, social isolation, and strict religious upbringing, as factors that could have warped the sisters' moral and cognitive development. A minority of scholars flirt with explanations outside the bounds of conventional science, hinting at paranormal influence, hereditary curses, or inexplicable psychological phenomena that resist categorization. The narrative contrasts these theories, demonstrating how each offers partial insight but fails to fully account for the scale, precision, and emotional resonance of the twins' actions. Attention is given to the human dimension of legacy. Survivors' descendants recount stories passed down as moral warnings, combining elements of caution, horror, and awe. Some families maintain private rituals or taboos to honor or avoid the memory of the twins, while others quietly relocate, seeking to escape the invisible shadow of Cold Hollow's darkest chapter. The narrative portrays the psychological inheritance of trauma, not just the immediate terror of 1852, but the way the story shapes fear, behavior, and social norms decades later. The summary emphasizes that the twins' story becomes less about concrete events and more about the ways human consciousness attempts to process incomprehensible evil or madness. The section also explores the cultural and historical discourse surrounding the case. Folklorists, historians, and authors repeatedly revisit the story, attempting to parse fact from myth, document from exaggeration. The narrative details debates over historical accuracy, examining preserved diaries, town records, and newspaper accounts that conflict in details yet converge in emotional truth, the pervasive sense of dread and the obliteration of innocence. The story of the twins becomes a lens through which scholars study the intersection of history, psychology, and moral panic, offering insight into human attempts to rationalize the unexplainable. Further, the summary reflects on the symbolic resonance of the twins within both local and broader historical consciousness. They become emblematic of duality, innocence and corruption, love and obsession, reason and madness. The narrative explores how this duality continues to captivate imagination, not through spectacle, but through the unsettling realization that extreme psychological phenomena can exist in the most ordinary of settings. The story transcends mere criminality, becoming a meditation on human vulnerability, societal denial, and the limits of understanding. Finally, the section closes with lingering questions and a reflective, almost poetic tone. Were the twins driven solely by their inner compulsions, or did forces beyond human comprehension influence them? Was their symbiotic bond a tragic inevitability, or could intervention have altered their trajectory? The narrative emphasizes that the answers remain elusive, reinforcing the enduring power of the story. The section leaves the audience with a sense of unresolved tension, a haunting reminder that some histories are not neat, some crimes not fully explainable, and some minds not fully fathomable. The echoes of the Winter's twins continue to resonate, their legacy a permanent shadow on Cold Hollow and a testament to the haunting intersection of innocence, desire, and darkness. This section examines the ultimate consequences of the Winter's twins' actions on both the historical record and the cultural memory of Cold Hollow. Decades after the events of 1852, the town exists in a state of uneasy remembrance, where the story of the twins is both remembered and deliberately obscured. The narrative opens with a depiction of Cold Hollow's landscape in later years, fields once abandoned now slowly cultivated, homes repaired but bearing subtle marks of neglect or hurried reconstruction, and the woods where so many horrors occurred remaining dense and silent, a physical reminder of the tragedy. The section emphasizes how the environment itself becomes a vessel for memory, where nature and human reconstruction coexist with lingering unease, and where silence carries as much weight as spoken recollection. The summary explores the tension between historical fact and myth-making. Over time, the story of the twins has been retold with variations, exaggerations, and omissions, creating a narrative that blurs the line between reality and folklore. Oral histories emphasize moral lessons, while written accounts lean into the psychological and sociological implications of the events. Scholars, journalists, and local storytellers debate which details are reliable, often revealing as much about the interpreters as about the twins themselves. The narrative highlights how collective memory selectively preserves certain truths while erasing others, underscoring the enduring influence of the twins on community consciousness. Attention is given to the psychological legacy. Generations of Cold Hollow residents inherit not only the story but a pervasive atmosphere of caution and unease. The summary details how some families maintain secret warnings about the woods or the twins' former home, others pass down fragmented accounts of the deaths, and some avoid discussing the events entirely, fearing that words might rekindle the past. The section emphasizes the way trauma can persist across generations, shaping perceptions, behaviors, and the moral framework of a community long after the physical horrors have faded. The narrative also examines the role of public fascination and historical inquiry. Researchers attempt to reconstruct the sequence of events, analyze the twins' behavior, and apply modern psychological theories. Yet each investigation encounters limitations, missing records, contradictory accounts, and the ineffable nature of human behavior make certainty impossible. The summary portrays a tension between desire for closure and recognition of unknowable truth, emphasizing that some aspects of the twins' actions and motives remain irreducibly mysterious. The narrative contrasts methodical historical study with the raw, lingering impact of rumor, fear, and fascination, showing that the story has become a touchstone for understanding both human psychology and communal myth-making. This section further explores the symbolic and literary dimensions of the twins' legacy. The narrative draws parallels between their duality and broader themes, innocence and corruption, love and obsession, reason and madness. The twins become archetypes in the collective imagination, a cautionary tale and an unsettling reflection of human potential for darkness. The section emphasizes the balance between empathy and horror, portraying the twins not as caricatures of evil but as complex individuals whose inner world defied comprehension, leaving indelible marks on those around them. Finally, the section closes with a reflective meditation on unresolved questions and lingering dread. Where did the twins go after their disappearance? Were their actions motivated purely by psychological compulsion, or was there an unknowable force guiding them? How does one reconcile the horror of 17 deaths with the fragile, human faces of the sisters themselves? The narrative leaves these questions deliberately unanswered, maintaining a haunting ambiguity. The section concludes by framing the twins as permanent shadows over Cold Hollow, a story that continues to ripple through time, reminding audiences that some histories, some crimes, and some minds resist closure, leaving echoes that never die. This final section reflects on the enduring enigma of the Winter's twins and the town of Cold Hollow, framing the events of 1852 not merely as historical incidents but as a psychological and cultural phenomenon whose echoes persist across generations. The narrative opens with the present-day remnants of Cold Hollow, where overgrown fields and abandoned homesteads stand alongside modestly restored homes, and the woods where the twins once roamed continue to loom like silent sentinels. The section emphasizes the atmosphere of persistent unease, portraying how landscapes can carry memory and how the town itself feels haunted, not necessarily by spirits, but by the weight of stories and unresolved trauma. The narrative sets a reflective, almost elegiac tone, blending historical recounting with literary meditation on memory, myth, and human psychology. The summary delves into the way the story of the twins has permeated regional folklore, literature, and historical inquiry. Local storytellers recount tales that oscillate between fact and imagination, preserving details of the girls' synchronized movements, obsessive bond, and the 17 deaths attributed to them. Meanwhile, historians and psychologists analyze diaries, sparse records, and oral histories, attempting to construct a coherent picture of events. Yet the narrative emphasizes the impossibility of absolute truth, documents conflict, recollections diverge, and the human mind struggles to make sense of behaviors that defy ordinary moral and psychological categories. This tension between fact and narrative underscores the section's theme of unfinished understanding. Attention is given to the symbolic resonance of the twins themselves. They are depicted as embodiments of duality, innocence and malevolence, connection and isolation, reason and madness. The narrative explores how their story challenges assumptions about identity, morality, and human capacity for darkness, illustrating that extreme psychological phenomena can arise from ordinary circumstances. The summary examines the ethical and emotional complexity of interpreting the twins' actions. While their deeds caused unimaginable suffering, they also reflect the tragic consequences of isolation, social repression, and familial dysfunction. The story becomes a lens through which to examine human nature itself, asking uncomfortable questions about the interplay of environment, psychology, and fate. The narrative further explores the cultural and historical attempts to make meaning of the tragedy. Scholars, writers, and journalists continue to revisit Cold Hollow's darkest chapter, producing analyses that range from clinical to literary, each grappling with the tension between horror and empathy, historical fact and myth. The summary emphasizes that these interpretations often reveal as much about the interpreters as the events themselves, highlighting the ways in which narrative, memory, and imagination converge to shape communal understanding. The story of the twins thus evolves over time, refracted through successive generations' attempts to contextualize, moralize, or comprehend it. The section also examines the psychological legacy for the descendants of Cold Hollow's survivors. Families retain both overt and subtle practices shaped by fear, superstition, and caution, demonstrating how trauma can be inherited culturally as well as emotionally. The narrative portrays ordinary acts, avoiding certain paths, whispering warnings, or refraining from discussing the past, as rituals of preservation and protection, ensuring that memory persists even when comprehension is incomplete. This ongoing legacy reinforces the section's central theme, that the story of the twins continues to inhabit the collective consciousness, shaping behavior, perception, and identity long after the immediate events have passed. Finally, the section closes with an evocative reflection on the unresolved nature of the Winters twins' story. Where they went, what truly motivated them, and whether the chain of events could have been altered are questions that remain deliberately unanswered, creating an enduring tension between curiosity and dread. The narrative leaves the audience with a lingering sense of uncertainty, emphasizing that some histories resist closure, some minds elude comprehension, and some shadows never fade. The story concludes with Cold Hollow itself as the final character, scarred, haunted, and forever carrying the unfinished tale of the twins, ensuring that their dark imprint endures as both warning and mystery for generations to come.